Today on the Perception and Action podcast, Perception and Action Journal Club number 11, Prospective Control. I'm joined by Andrew Wilson, Tyler Yearby, and Garrett Boyum to discuss how an athlete can act to achieve something in the future without actually predicting the future. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I had a really fun discussion with Andrew, Tyler, and Garrett about the important concept of prospective control. We talked about how it differs from predictive control, the patterns of behavior it creates, how it de-emphasizes the importance of reaction time, how it changes with practice, and affordance-based control. Hope you enjoy. We're live, so welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception and Action Journal Club. Today we're talking control of action, and we're going to talk about this kind of very important concept within the ecological approach, dynamical systems approach, prospective control, kind of an alternative to the traditional way we think about controlling our movements and controlling our actions, which is more predictive kind of control. So we're going to get into this topic in depth. And as with all of these, if anyone has any questions along the way, but please put them in the YouTube or wherever you're watching, and I can bring them up on the screen. I'll do a quick introduction because all three of these guys have been on one of these before. So today we have Tyler Yearby and Garrett Boyum from Emergence joining us again. And we have Andrew Wilson from Leeds Beckett. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. So what I thought I would do, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. By the way, to kind of preparation for this, we looked at the article, a review article that Gilles Montan wrote quite a few years ago now, Prospective Control in Sport. The kind of basic covers it. It's a little bit out of date now, actually. There's been a lot of research, but I think it covers the basic concepts. But prospective control, I think, is something you could probably explain in 10 different ways. So what I thought we'd do is we'd go around and everyone just could say a few words about what a few words about what prospective control is to you, how you would explain it, maybe an elevator pitch, whatever you want to think of it. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to go into super depth, just kind of the basic concepts. And I think I bet you we could all add a little bit to the explanation as we go around. So maybe, do you want to start, Tyler? Do you want to take a crack at it?
Sure, yeah. Let's do it. I love this because I had no idea we're going to be doing this, which makes it even better. I think for me, the easiest way to describe it is to give an example. If I'm an individual, an athlete that's moving to intercept a ball, and you pick the sport, football, baseball, basketball, that's rather than it being something that, like you mentioned, being predictive, where I know the landing point of that particular ball, I'm rather going to be using information that as I continue to move, I generate information, and that information specifies what my action capabilities are. And so essentially, I need to intercept that ball. So I might need to accelerate to essentially cancel out the vertical type movements. I need to decelerate. I need to turn. And the information is essentially going to specify what I need to do online in real time. And the importance of that is because the way in which I interact with the environment is going to allow me to have the information I need as a performer to make sure that I intercept that ball at the correct moment in time, or whether I choose to pull off and take it off the wall if we're talking about baseball, for example. So for me, it is very much regulating my behavior, and it is an information-based type control. And there's a circular link between that movement and that information such that it shouldn't be separated and can't be studied in that way as well.
Okay, great. Andrew, do you want to anything to add to that, or a different way of?
Yeah. So prospective control is probably one of my favorite just sort of things in the ecological approach, not only because there's a ton of evidence in favor of it, but also it's just a really interesting topic because it's one of those rare ecological topics that's being pitched explicitly against a more representational approach, right? So prospective control versus predictive control. And these things are sometimes actually put head to head, which is always fun and is not that common in the research literature. So for me, it's an ecological attempt to try and address a really real problem. And the very real problem is that we clearly seem to organize our behavior sometimes with respect to something that hasn't happened yet. And that might be in the near future, etc. And the classic, obviously, is the outfielder. You have to be at the right place at the right time in order to catch the ball. But that point in space and time is in the future because it just is, right? Because the ball's busy doing something else right now. And that's weird when you think about it. That's a big ask of a system. But the predictive versus the prospective sort of definitions really lay out the two different ways of thinking about what's going on. The predictive model, the predictive account says that because we have some kind of representational system in between us and the world, then that system has to be predicting, has to know where to take us. The ecological claim is that there's nothing in between us and the world. Right? There is us, there is the world, and we are entangled with it, right? And so the question is, if we're entangled with the world, how do we interact with a world that hasn't happened yet? And so it's a huge question, right? And if we didn't have an answer for it, then we'd be in big trouble. But luckily, it turns out that when you ask the question, when you're forced to ask the question, and start thinking, okay, what sort of information is around, and that you could connect yourself to in the here and now, such that if you do that, then you'll end up achieving something in the future. And it's a weird way of thinking about what's going on, but it's the essence of the ecological approach. So it's cool, and and that's what it's about. It's about trying to find a way to identify how what we're currently doing will allow us to be somewhere else in the future, right? And it turns out when you go poking around, there are options. The reason you can catch a fly ball is that there are ways of doing this, and it's cool.
Mm-hmm. Garrett, do you have?
So I guess for me, I'm going to kind of talk about it in the way that Andrew did a little bit in terms of what interests me the most about it, because I think Tyler and Andrew both gave really good answers to it. But I think this is really interesting when we think about it in terms of hitting in baseball, which is something that I'm super interested about. And I know there are people currently doing some research on it with gaze behavior. And I think it's a really interesting alternative to this notion of like, are we trying to predict where the ball is going to be, or are we gathering information, moving, and trying to use that information as it's developing to get us into position to actually be able to hit the ball? And so I think that was one of the cool things to read about in the paper, was that this stuff actually applies to very fast actions that would be something like hitting a baseball. And I think that because of some of the research of like how we can't track the ball the entire way, makes people think that, well, there must be a predictive element to it. And that's kind of what I hope to kind of explore a little bit today here as well.
Yeah, no, those are all great. I think they'll connect well together. And a couple of us, we use, the classic example, prototypical, is the catching a fly ball in baseball. And we'll talk a lot about that, but I'm going to make us push beyond the prototypical example. In particular, we'll talk what happens when things get really fast, right? That's one of the critiques. But yeah, the way I would put it too, I think you're all hit the nail on the head. You're trying to organize your behavior right to the future, trying to achieve something in the future. That's what perspective means, right? In the future. And you could do it one of two ways. You somehow have to organize your behavior in terms of where the ball is going to land and when it's going to be there. And the obvious assumption is you need to know those things. And to me, perspective information is like a miracle of nature. Like, how could you possibly achieve something in the future without knowing the future? It's like, yeah, it's like ridiculous. Like, how could I? So it seems impossible that you'd have to do that. So in predictive control, I try to know where the ball is going to be, where it's going to land, and when it's going to get there and generate a movement. In prospective control, there's this information I can pick up that can tell me, but basically the express term I like, it tells me about my current future. So it tells me if I currently keep doing what I'm going to do, what's going to happen in the future. And that future, am I going to arrive where the ball is at the right time? And so if you keep this arrangement going, you're going to achieve your action without actually ever knowing having to predict these things, which I think is incredible. And so that's one of the things that attracted me to. And we talked about it a little bit. Is there any other things people want to pull out about what kind of really appeals to how it appeals to you? You find one of the reasons I like. Maybe I can start. One of the things I like about it is it solves the problem of perception and action at the same time, right? The predictive model, even if I could make a perfect prediction about where the ball is going to land, when it's going to land there, what do I do next, right? How fast do I run? Do I do an all-out sprint to get there? Do I adjust my speed somehow based on time to contact? All the predictive does is tell you what you need to know. Prospective information tells you what you need to do, right? So at the same time, it solves perception and action at the same time. You don't have to. You figure if the Chapman model, if the ball's accelerating too fast, I speed up. If it's not accelerating at all, I keep doing what I'm doing. So it solves what you need to do for action on the surface level. Obviously, there's more to it than that.
And to piggyback on that, Rob, that part's really intriguing to me because when we talk about the Chapman fly ball example, Michaels has given presentations and used that example before and discussed it in depth. I think that's beautiful. And the other part that I like to look at, American football is my number one sport. And this could be said for any tackling-based sports, but we're talking about the primary task of intercepting the ball at an endpoint. That way that there's an out, or that way I have received that ball so I can do something else with it. And so being the fact that I work with American football and we talk about moving bodies and where we are in space. So if we talk about intercepting that ball, and let's say it's on an outside breaking route in American football to where there's fixed boundaries that are there. We talked about in the Journal Club with you last time, or I mentioned there being constraints that are in place that are fixed, such as the boundary and the markings on a field. And so before a ball is snapped, I know I'm running an out route. I'm going to be adjusting my movements based off of what the defender is doing. There's that relationship, that dyadic relationship that's there. But then after I've received that ball, there's secondary tasks such as not getting absolutely crushed or being able to exploit that space. Mm-hmm. And so when we have that time to contact, such as the ball that's coming, that rate of expansion, and then we also have the space that is there that's obviously changing, very rapidly. We have the directions of the defenders that are converging upon me, and I'm now trying to do something with that. That's the part that's really intriguing for me, because when we talk about information-based control and allowing for us to regulate our action online, to me, there's not anything, there couldn't be anything such as a predictive mechanism that allows me to be in one spot, because I'm constantly changing my behavior based off of the surroundings around me. And those surroundings are obviously the individuals that are there. It's the wind that's present. It's changing that time to contact. My ability to perceive spin. And then Garrett, you mentioned how maybe the other systems, I kind of like to think about it. I like the resonance systems paper, and I don't know how to pronounce his name actually, but Takes and colleagues, I believe is what it is. He talks about how perception is essentially, the whole body of the athlete. And so I think it's a systems-based approach. I don't think it's exclusive to just the visual system, even though that's a strong system, strong perceptual system, but yet the auditory information that's there, the haptic information that I get based off essentially where, defenders are around me is really, really unique. And that's the part that keeps driving me towards really and truly a representative learning approach or representative task design. And really the need behind the why of having that in sport is that if we essentially try to create these actions in vacuums, it's not gonna unfold very well in a dynamic sporting environment where there is a lot of complexity. And I don't want to get too far into this, because I would love to talk about information scaling and complexity and how that lives with this as well.
Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, so there's two things. So Rob, I think, I'm currently in a reading group and blogging about Turvey's Lectures on Perception book. And it's classic Turvey, right? It's really hard work, but it's so rewarding. And it was just funny, your comment that prospective control intrinsically connects perception to action because it's information about what to do next. Is like, this is one of my prospective controls, just one of my favorite examples of anything ecological, because it just, that's the essence of the ecological approach right there, that these things are not separate and that these two things are so entangled and so intertwined. And that's a hard thing for people to get their heads around because we spend so much time talking about them as different things, and we don't even have a word for the whole system. We just call it the perception-action system, right? And so, like one of Turvey's big things is this interconnectedness, and you're absolutely right. I think Prospective Control is super cool about that. I wanted to throw one thing in that Tyler was just talking about, and of course, one of the things about it, I kind of want to throw this out just to see what people think, because I've been thinking about it recently and I don't know the answer. You talked about this as information-based control, right? So there's an example of where, and it's always described this way, right? People are organizing their behavior with respect to some information variable you're trying to move so as to cancel out optical acceleration or whatever, right? So a few years ago, I read Brett Fagen's stuff on affordance-based control. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan. I like it a lot, and I haven't yet quite fully got it into my thinking. But one of the essences of his challenge is, in fact, that affordance-based control is the correct ecological analysis rather than information-based control. And that distinction, I'm still kind of struggling with it. In the context of prospective control and any of these kinds of things, affordances are immediately connected because affordances are about opportunities for action. They're not. Affordance perception is not event perception. Event perception is about what's happening now. Affordance perception is about what might happen in the future, right? Mm-hmm. And so Brett's big challenge, which I think is an excellent challenge and as yet unmet challenge, is how to reconceptualize these information-based control strategies that we have all this evidence for. Think of them as affordance-based strategies, because I think that's going to be the thing that really kicks it up a notch. Like, we're good, it's going well, let's really commit to this and see what happens. I don't know the answer. It just occurred to me to throw that in when you were talking about information-based control. I don't want to know if anyone's been thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Andrew. To put it back to the fly ball example, I'll try an example of what you're trying to. So imagine there's a fly ball hit in front of me. The optical information is telling me I need to run faster. Like I'm coupling my running to the information. I keep running faster. Yeah, I'm never going to catch it. It's hit too short. If I just base my movement on information, I would keep running faster, and I'd get to the ball and it would skip by me and it would turn a single into a triple. At some point, I need to recognize I don't have the capacity to regulate my behavior this way to close this information.
Caught by me.
Yeah. And that's an affordance. I need to perceive the affordance of catchability at some point. I need to recognize I cannot satisfy this control law I'm using is not going to work based on my capacity. Yeah.
So I'm glad that that opened up the invitation there, because when I was giving the example earlier and talked about essentially stopping and taking the fly ball off the wall, that's kind of what I was trying to delineate there with the Fagen example and the affordance-based control. Why we actually have that in our course underpinnings, and one of the reasons why that part is so intriguing to me and something I'm honestly working through a lot myself is if information specifies the affordances, it's specifying the affordances based off of my action capabilities. And like Turvey has talked to, you brought up Turvey, essentially as an organism, I need to have effectivities that essentially can match the affordances, or the information that is available. And the affordances are specified by the information based on my action capabilities. So if I don't have the ability to get to that point due to my, my speed and whatnot, even if I'm trying to cancel it out, but yet I don't have that effectivity as an animal, I'm not able to intercept that fly ball. And so for me, that's where we start talking about Gibson and essentially rejecting and accepting affordances based on our action capabilities. That example that Rob, you just now gave would essentially be me rejecting the opportunity of trying to continue to keep moving because I don't have the capability to get there. But information is what is guiding that movement. And whether it's high order invariance, it's essentially regulating my behavior, but there still has to be some type of. And that's where I start thinking about emergent decision making. There's some type of emergent decision making that occurs because there has to be some decision that is made for me to either try to catch it still or not catch it, or how I contort my body in a certain way in order to make sure I still can receive that ball. Kind of bringing it back to the paper a little bit, and I can't remember exactly what page it's on, but it's talking about essentially the opening rate and angles of the gymnastics athletes as they're essentially trying to land. And there's a fair amount of high variability there based off of the information that is available, or essentially what their opportunities for action or invitations for action are there. And I kind of think about that in the same way, trying to think it back to my sport in football. If there is an outside breaking route and the ball is put in a decent spot, but the cornerback or the safety is essentially converging at a very high rate of speed, and there's a strong likelihood essentially of getting hit or taking some type of contact, I may essentially not move my arms out to intercept that ball until later in the movement, because I'm trying to make myself as small as possible. And there's no way that that's consciously going through, in my opinion, a receiver's head. I think it actually happens subconsciously, or it happens based off of perspective control. And so essentially at the last minute, I reach up, take that ball. And to me, that is a deceptive action, because one thing that I didn't see anywhere mentioned in that paper. I've also read a lot of Fajan and Turvey's information affordances and control of action in sport, which I love that paper. It's mentioned in Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, it's perspective control is, but it's not talking about deceptive actions. So as a defender, if I'm trying to intercept a receiver that is carrying the ball, he is trying to essentially disrupt the stability of that system, or essentially try to escape or get around me without me making the tackle. And so I'm still using that perspective type control to allow for me to be at that end point whenever he is getting there, but it's not the same as a fly ball now that is traveling at a particular rate of speed that is essentially all of a sudden going to hit the brakes and take a sharp right. Whereas in American football, that in fact can happen. So that's where that future state of affairs, or the future, what can happen, the tendencies or the emergent tendencies, the intrinsic dynamics of that particular ball carrier and the orientation of how they're moving, the speed in which they're moving, specifies a lot about what my opportunities are. So I'm trying to work through where the deceptive actions also live in perspective control.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Garrett, did you want to?
So one of the things that I think is really interesting that Andrew, that you brought up, and I was reading in an article in addition to this, when I was looking more into embodied cognition, which I think is another thing that could probably speak to this as well, about like things being entangled. They mentioned in a paper similarly, like perception is the perception of affordances. So like, to go back to what Rob was saying about perspective control, helping you figure out what you should do, gives you the information of what you should do. Affordances basically tell you what you should do. So that perception of the affordance will tell you or direct your movement. And I like, Andrew, that you delineated the difference between information and affordances, because you could be able to perceive information but not know what to do with it. But if you're able to perceive an affordance, it actually directs you to like what you should do, or helps guide your intention to help achieving that goal.
Yeah. Yes, I'd agree with that. The reason I keep banging on about the distinction between information and affordances is it's the first thing Jeff Bingham taught me when I was in his lab, and it's the most important thing, and it's being forgotten. Mm-hmm. This is why I really like Brett's affordance-based control challenge to information-based control. The thing to remember is that, affordances are of the world, right? They're properties of the world, unless you're someone else and you're wrong. So they're properties of the world. They're about the world. And the thing about the world is that the vast majority of it is, to some degree or another, over there. We're not in mechanical contact with it, right? It's not pushing on me to make me do my things. So it's about cause and effect. How does that thing over there cause me to do one thing rather than another thing? The link is information, right? So we are informationally connected to these things, but you've got to keep these things distinct in the analysis. So I agree. It's really important to do that, because you're perceiving the affordance. You're not perceiving the information, but you're perceiving the affordance by virtue of resonating to, detecting, whatever the appropriate word is. You're perceiving the affordance by virtue of the information, and the information has consequences as well. So it's an important thing to keep in.
Those are great. Garrett, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that it's important to make a distinction between information that is non-specifying versus specifying. Like, because the specifying information is the thing that would reveal the affordance. And I think too, within this, of like, if we're talking about embodied cognition, the intention of the performer will lead to what the information affords. And so whether we're talking about a surface or whatever, like based upon the intention of the actor, that will guide what affordance they'll be able to find and pick up.
Yeah. No, I think that's great.
To the direct learning stuff, actually. But
yeah. I want to get back to your point about deception, Tyler. I just want to make a couple more points about kind of what perspective control is. So I would argue it's a way more parsimonious explanation of control, right? Because it's solving the perception, as I said, at the same time. Well, a good point Jill makes in the article is it's not just a matter of time scale, right? So if you keep updating your prediction during the movement, that's not perspective control, right? You're still making, if you update your prediction of where the ball is going to land halfway there, you're still using predictive, you're doing it in a totally different way. So you can do online predictive control, if that sounds weird. They're different things. So I think that's an important point. Another example I would make is another good example is we've already talked about the fly ball is the bearing angle strategy, right? So in football, if you want to tackle someone running on a field, you would think you would have to predict where they're going to be in the future, which is extremely hard in football, right? They're running, juking, but all you have to do is keep your angle the same between you and them, and you will arrive. So it's if you satisfy this control law, you'll get the future you want. That's the essence of perspective control. And I also tease, I got Brett's scheduled for an interview on the podcast in a few weeks. So if you have any questions, but Tyler, the deception's an interesting one because, Gibson talks about acting to perceive, but we're talking about our own perception. Deception is acting to alter someone else's perception, right? It's acting to give the false intention of what you are planning. Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting.
So an example would be, I work with a lot of receivers in football. And an example would be that as a defensive back, there's a lot of tasks, but essentially you're trying to blanket me to where I can't get open or I'm not able to catch the ball. That's what the main task is. And there's obviously a number of ways in which to do that. And if I'm running a route as a defender and I don't have someone that's pressing me at the line, so there's essentially some space that is available. I'm not wanting to, number one, if we go back to like Bernstein's approach, I'm not wanting to accomplish the same task in the same way all the time because I'm not going to be very adaptable. I'm not going to be dexterous. So essentially there's a level of repetition without repetition, meaning I'm going to run that route in a variety of different ways. In addition to that being deceptive, that's one example. I may use my eyes to peek to a space on the field. And even though I'm peeking to that space, it's essentially trying to create space to separate or disturb the system stability between that 1v1 dyadic relationship. Because if I'm running an outside breaking route and I'm going to be needing to have space available at that route, I'm at the line of scrimmage, I'm not being pressed. And so I'm running a route in a different way. I may peek to a space and into a particular part of the field. That way they're perceiving what I'm doing to create space for me to be able to get open. So that's an example of what I mean by being deceptive with that. And that's off the ball. The ball is not even in flight yet. And so for that defender, if he's trying to blanket me, if that's his task, and he's using information in a bearing angle to guide his ability to do that, if I can, deceive him, that's going to allow me to be successful in that action. And so that's kind of the example that I'm giving and the reason behind that. And that part just is very real and meaningful in sport. And so whether that is truly in line with what we're discussing, I know that is exactly how these principles are being applied. And maybe it's the education of intention coupled with the attention, such as the direct learning example. But point being is we're, myself specifically trying to take these ideas that are these theoretical principles and bring them into real life. I don't mean bring them into real life, like bring them into sport and make it meaningful to the athlete without me having to do what we're doing right now and discuss all of this. Mm-hmm. But yet this is, for me personally, this is a need for utilizing approaches such as the constraints-led approach and allowing for the manipulation of constraints and the task constraints, the environmental constraints, maybe some explicit guidance from me as the coach to allow for those emergent tendencies and helping facilitate the process of self-organization in order for them to use that information prospectively to afford them or invite them to do certain actions on the field.
Yeah, I think those are good points.
Can I jump in?
Sorry, did you want to jump in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the thing about deception is actually kind of intriguing. So one of the reasons why it's really hard to fake someone out is that the perceptual information you use to perceive what someone is doing is it's a lawful consequence of their dynamical characteristics, right? And there's only so much you can do. Like, so for example, if you're going to cut left, there's only so much cutting right you can fake before you are cutting right and you are no longer cutting left, right? Just for the sheer physics of trying to move your body in various directions. And when it turns out people are very sensitive to these kinds of things, and that's why it's tricky. Turns out it's not impossible, though. So mimes exist, right? Mimes exist, but miming is hard, right? Miming really well, like really actually genuinely making it look like you can't get out of that glass cage. It's really hard, right? Why? Because you have to simulate all the dynamics that would normally be producing all the responses. And I just want to flag up that there's a great paper. So Frickham and Rinson, 86, I think it is the first kind of, it's called the kinematic specification of dynamics. And it's basically where they introduce this idea that I rest on a lot. And they do a lot of things with, like point light displays, right? So the cool thing about point light displays is you can show all the motion, you can present all the information about how something is moving. And then you can ask people to make judgments about the underlying dynamics. So you can get people to judge the gender of a walker, right? Because men and women walk differently. Why? Because of the distribution of mass and all those kinds of things is different, and that has consequences for the way you walk, et cetera, et cetera. They did a great study. There's an element of that paper, though. They actually studied deception. So what they did was that they recorded point light displays of people lifting a heavy weight versus pretending to lift a heavy weight. And then they got people to make judgments about those displays. And the first thing that came out of it was that it was mind-meltingly obvious to everybody which ones were the real ones and which ones were the fakes. Mm-hmm. And so there were two things going on. For the fake conditions, people could clearly visually perceive by the way these people were moving two things. They could perceive that they were trying to pretend to look like they were lifting a heavy weight, and simultaneously they could perceive that they were faking, right? And all of that was just in the way that, because they weren't basically moving in a way that you move when you have a heavy weight, right? So, and yet mimes are possible. Okay, so it gets back to this deception thing. Like, how do you deceive, and how do you tell the difference? Good deception requires you to actually do something remarkably similar to what it is you're trying to make it look like you're doing, without falling so far into it that you can't do anything else. Like I say, like if you're cutting left versus cutting right, there's just flat out a point where you physically can't reorient your body. You're heading that way and you've got no freaking choice, right? So, but just to kind of identify that there is a literature on thinking about these things from an ecological point of view. Rinson stuff is top grade, and it's complicated. Miming is hard because these things are tied. And so actually one thing would be super cool. Who's good in football? Who's a good deceiver in football? Who's really good at faking?
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot of people. And that's what's interesting about this. While I'm trying to give you a perfect example, because I love the examples that you're giving as far as the tasks. The tasks are quite different, though. There's different level of consequences that are present. And so and then it also kind of speaks to, I guess, the need for effectivities, obviously, and the reason behind the abilities of individuals. So there are a lot of different receivers that have those capabilities. I mean, during my younger days and growing up, Michael Irvin for the Dallas Cowboys was someone that was pretty deceptive, but yet he was also very physical as a receiver. So there's different capabilities that are present. As far as individuals that play, I work with a couple. I'm not going to say names, but they've had to utilize these opportunities of theirs because of limitations or rate limiters in other areas. Mm-hmm. And so it's something that we've had to work on often, simply because it's allowed them to create space so they can actually do something with it. And so, I like the research. I have actually read that paper. The part that was so intriguing to me, and this is something that a colleague of ours, Michael Zwiefel, talks about, who actually was a receiver, is essentially maintaining, a similar type posture through certain parts of your vertical displacement. And when I say vertical, like a vertical type route, because there's not that information or those contextual priors, that information, the body orientation that's going to be available for those perceptual systems to pick up as early. And so with that, using something like a subtle movement to the head or eye movements will essentially, perturb that system, even if it's very subtly, and then a movement, and then another movement is made. I mean, there's not like discrete actions like I stop here and make movement. That's not obviously what I'm meaning, but my point is it's just all intertwined. And I know you guys have both mentioned Turby. We've mentioned perception action. One of the first times I saw him present I was actually on a presentation on YouTube, I believe it's in the early 2013-ish, like that. And he said dual aspects of the same event. Mm-hmm. And I paused that there and I thought to myself, that actually makes sense for the first time, which is what led to me giving examples of essentially tearing a $100 bill, and neither side serves a purpose as the whole once did. So essentially, they're intertwined, interconnected, they're confluent, conflated, such as he explains in that presentation. And so if these athletes, such as the defensive backs, are trying to create these perception action couplings that are relevant for them, based off of the information that's there and their opportunities that are specified by the affordances, then I want to try to disrupt that system stability. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially what we do often. In our not just receivers, but receivers as in running backs, tight ends, individuals who are going to be skill players that catch the ball. Because to your point, there are a lot of really, really athletic people, and it is a very complex system, and there are heavy consequences that are present. And so I think we all know those underpin ideas of nonlinear pedagogy. And so for me, I also want to have those creative motor actions that emerge based off of some of these tightly intertwined action couplings that may not have been capable had I tried to actually do them consciously.
Two really cool things pop out of that. The first is look at the good deceivers and try and figure out what they're doing, because that's interesting. And then the second thing for me is that it's a reconceptualization again of what faking out is. You're not trying to make your opponent know or think that you're moving in one direction rather than another. You're trying to make them perceive that you're moving in one direction or another, or doing one thing rather than another. And that's a whole different way of thinking about what faking out is. And then it would be, with that mindset, it would be super cool to look at. That's why I was asking, who's the good fakers, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of it.
What are they physically capable of doing that works? Yeah. And very cool.
Yeah. So I'm connecting this back. There's a way I think I can connect this back to perspective. Oh, well, it's perspective information still. But one of the things I wanted to draw on, I think Jules does a really good job in the paper, is talking about one of the things you mentioned, Andrew, that I think this area is cool, is it makes predictions about patterns of behavior you should see, right? It makes specific predictions what actions should look like, and it's different than predictive. So I don't know if we want to talk about Garrett. Do you want to? I don't know if you know what I'm on about, or any thoughts about that.
So a little bit on that, I guess, too, of how I've been thinking about it, at least in relationship to baseball. Mm-hmm. And for hitters and pitchers, I've been watching a lot of wiffle ball lately, and just the crazy movement that they can put on pitches and stuff. And
it hurts my brain.
But what I noticed, at least there, it's a little bit more obvious of how when they make balls move, they'll actually change up arm slots. And there's a level of deception that goes on with that. And it made me wonder if part of the reason it works so effectively is that the expectation of where the arm slot's going to be. And same thing, too, with what, Tyler, you were talking about, and Andrew, of being deceptive. There's part of that may play into, there's a certain expectation of where we're anticipating either them going, or what we perceive the intention of the other person is, and that expectation can get subverted slightly when it alters and deviates from that, and that amount of time it takes for us to reconnect with the information can potentially be enough for our opponent, so to speak, to actually do what they want to do.
Wiffle ball pulls you into a movement that you can't reverse your way out of in time. That's cool. And yeah, that's 100% my experience of wiffle ball, first of all. But yeah.
But did you want to talk, Andrew, about kind of the behavioral predictions you see different? Yeah.
This is, again, I think I agree 100%. This is why it's so cool. Is it does. It's a claim of the ecological approach that makes very specific predictions about how a movement will unfold over time, and it makes weird predictions. So there's so the original one is it's Montagna and et al. It's him and what's his
Bastan,
name?
maybe. Yeah.
I'm sure Bootsma was somewhere. On Prospective Control and movement reversals is the paper, right? Mm-hmm. It's just amazing. And the weird thing about movement reversals, right? So their task was you were trying to intercept something. You were trying to catch something that was heading towards you and on some heading, on some angle, at some speed, etc. And you had a wee slider, and you were reduced to a 1 degree of freedom movement, and your job's just to arrive at the right time. And there were two absolutely beautiful things that came out of that paper. And the first thing was that it's not like if you think about it predictively, like this task actually wasn't that hard in the sense that, you could there was plenty of opportunity to predict where to go. And the prediction says that that's what you should do, right? You should just predict where it's going to end up, move there and wait. Or arrive in time or whatever. But whatever it is, you just move there and you're done. The prospective control, it turns out, predicts, like, because you're tracking, and they had a specific hypothesis about the particular visual angle information that you were coupling to. And what they did was they just plotted out the behavior of that variable over time. And what happened is that as that variable unfolded, if you kept tracking it, you would overshoot. So you'd go past where you had to end up, but then as the event unfolded, the information variable would bring you back. And so it predicted these things called movement reversals. And that's just 100% what you see. Mm-hmm. And you see movement reversals, the best thing, you see them even if you start the person's hand where they need to be when the thing is going to hit. So the idea, and it's just a beautiful, it's the signature of being coupled to an information variable, your movement unfolding as the way that information variable unfolds over time. And if you follow the whole thing through, you're fine. Everything ends up in the right place at the right time. But if you kind of looked at any moment, it would be like, oh, why are you moving that way? Like, why would you predict end up that way? And it's super weird. And then, so that was the original experimental demonstration. Then they went and found it in goalkeepers. That's the other thing I love about that. They actually went, do people do this crazy thing in the real world? And you see goalkeepers as they're trying to intercept a ball or tracking something in, and they've done this with real goalkeepers and goalkeepers in VR where they've got weird ball trajectories and yada, yada, yada. And goalkeepers show movement reversals. They move this way and they move that way and they overshoot where they need to be and they come back. They're very clearly tracking fairly well-defined visual information. It's chef's kiss. It's beautiful. Yeah.
And kind of, I'll let you tell it. I just wanted to of a study that connects with that. I always think of it. Bootsma and colleagues did this one where they had balls on a string they were releasing at you. You couldn't see the string, so you had to catch it. But the most interesting condition was they had a condition where the ball was coming exactly where you were standing every time, but they were releasing it from different angles. So sometimes it was coming straight at you. Sometimes it was coming from the left or right. Predictive control, why would you move, right? You should predict right away the ball's coming, but people did different things based on the angle.
Moving.
Yeah.
And that was the one with different, like inflated balls, heavily inflated, not inflated, or not inflated as much. That's the same.
Oh, this is a different one. But that's kind of thing. Yeah. So Tyler, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, when you guys are all talking about this, I think about the intrinsic dynamics, essentially the emergent tendencies of individuals. And if I'm watching film, and athletes watch film on a fairly regular basis, whether it be the coach, whether it be the athlete, they're watching for tendencies. They're watching from tendencies from performers. And so looking back or speaking back to the paper I mentioned earlier, Information, Affordances, and the Control of Action in Sport, Fajan and colleagues, and they talk about essentially serving as a preparatory role in action, as well as helping it tune online as it unfolds. That's the way they describe it. Actually, I think I could pull it up here real quick. They say, more generally, prospective control refers to the means by which actors adapt their behavior in advance to the constraints and behavioral opportunities in the environment. Perception thus plays a preparatory role in action, as well as an online role in tuning action as it unfolds. And so it's interesting because for me, what this highlights is it highlights the need for seeing what the tendencies look like of the athletes that I will face or could potentially face for those that get an opportunity to actually evaluate film. But it doesn't mean they're predicting their behavior. And I know how he's going to cut every single time. That the way in which the speeds are changing, the space that is available, and essentially what I'm perceiving as an individual visual perception, auditory, everything, all of that is going to help regulate my action based off of what I'm invited to do at that particular time. So I actually see the need in having an idea of kind of tying it back to the deceptive aspects. If I know a receiver is relatively deceptive, I may intentionally try to disrupt some of his deceptive qualities by maybe pressing him at the line more so, like if I'm a defensive back. So essentially, I'm using information that was available far ahead of time, or it could be something as subtle, kind of bringing it back to some of the studies done in soccer. You posted about it, I think, earlier today, Rob, where as the expert goalkeepers will oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes move later, but that doesn't mean that they're not moving a little bit to pick up that information, body orientation, obviously the way in which the foot is going to come in contact with the ball is going to give off a lot about what the spin is doing of the ball, especially if it's colored, such as they talked about, Montagna talked about as far as the color and the lateral displacement that occurs. So anyways, I digress, but my point being is that perspective information, I think, can serve as a preparatory type information as well, based on where I am on the field. Am I near the hash? Am I near the numbers? There's going to be less space available for action.
Yeah.
Well, would you think about that as calibration?
What's that?
Would you think about that as calibration more than
sort of scaling the perceptual motor system? I mean, I would think about that as being highly calibrated and then needing to recalibrate. And I
as a process, as the thing, as the way in which that is having its effect on your current behavior. I'm just trying to think about it in the context of, because at one level that's weird, right? Like we're slipping into a place where it's really easy to talk about knowledge. It's really easy to talk about what the player knows about their opponent because they have, right? And as a strict ecological
knowledge of.
Right? So the question is, what's the perceptual mechanism? And I'm thinking about one of the things I like about the direct learning stuff that Jacobs and Michael put together. I like the distinction they make: education of intention, attention, and then calibration. 3 separate elements of the learning process. So I was just wondering, anybody, Rob, like clearly people can do the thing you just described. So the question is, ecologically, how are they doing it? Like, what's going on there? I would stick it in the category somehow of calibration, but that's a bit of a I don't know how else to think about it. Does anybody have a way of thinking about it that doesn't use the word knowledge? Right.
I want to add something. Go ahead. Jump in.
So what specifically were you referring to? Which action were you referring to specifically?
Oh, sorry. The watching the tapes. And getting your behavior. I'm facing off against player X, and I know player X is a deceptive kind of player and is good at pulling it off, so I will do certain things. I want to know how we talk about that ecologically without it being predictive, without it being,
I think it's education of intention. And I first of all, I don't think there's a difference. I think they all obviously are interwoven together. But the reason why I say education of intention, essentially how I aim to interact in the environment, how I aim to interact with this individual. So if I'm aiming to interact by disrupting their system stability, based off of the down that is present, because we talk about the constraints that are available, it's the down and distance. It's 2nd and 5. He's likely going to be running a slant route here. And so, or could be running a slant route here. That's where I feel that film study is vital, not only because of the emergent behaviors of the individual, but also having awareness of the constraints that are available prior to ball being snapped. Because prior to ball being snapped is going to shape my intentions, which is also going to educate where my attention is directed in order for me to pick up more specifying information, which allows me to scale my action capabilities or calibrate. And you actually posted, this is kind of funny you say that, it just reminded me, when you posted a while ago, a kangaroo jumping on a trampoline.
Oh, yeah.
And you posted like something about, he isn't calibrated at this time. Well, that now highlights the need, or it really emphasizes to me the need for representative learning design. How is there going to be, if my behaviors don't look anything like the sport and I'm training in a very decontextualized setting, how am I ever going to be able to regulate my behavior based off of the affordances that are invited or open for me to act on? So anyway.
I think putting it education of intention is exactly right. The problem with that is the education of intention. That's the one we don't know how it works.
Yeah, I would think of this. I think of it as calibration, Andrew. And the analogy I would give is when you learn to drive your car and your significant other's car and use the right brake force. So you don't all of a sudden, like when you first do it or you do a rental car, right, you do that. You hit the brake too hard. After time, you learn to calibrate. You have calibrations for both of those things. So I think you can have multiple calibrations that you can, I don't know how we, go about where they are or what. So I think that's what it is with players. With one player, I can move as soon as I see him go left. So my coupling is like that. The other guy, I can't. I have to have a different. I'm using the same information, the same movement, but I can't go as strong. Maybe.
I do want to make a few points there. Number one is, and I hope the listeners out there understand that by no means am I saying that I'm choosing my actions necessarily for the entirety of the play based off of that. It may just be how the initial conditions start. And so for me, that's the reason behind the knowledge of, such as, Gibson spoken to. And the second thing, the question I would ask you would be, do we need to separate them between intention, attention, calibration? Aren't they all kind of intertwined and interwoven together? Is there a need to bucket them into certain places? Just out of curiosity, I'm not an experimental psychologist, so I don't know.
One thing I wanted to jump in and at least insert into the conversation. And back to what, Andrew, your question about the film and stuff and the sort of pre-knowledge, so to speak. Mm-hmm. To me, it seems to be this is why, Rob, you put me onto this, and Sean has been on me to dive into this more, but embodied cognition, this notion that this knowledge is embodied and is an extension of your movement. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, what Tyler was speaking about, all this stuff is intertwined, when you're talking about intention and education of attention, at least for me right now, it seems to me embodied cognition nicely just pulls all that together.
Yeah. And I think, Tyler, your point, applying it, maybe you're right, you don't need to, but I think if you want to do the stuff like Bill and Brett do, and Andrew's done with throwing, where you want to develop the actual control law and model, you need to understand what is changing. Is it the parameters of the control law, the variables in the control law, or the actual goal, if you want to model? But I totally understand your point. For application, maybe it doesn't matter where this occurs. Yeah.
That's kind of, because one of the things I'm interested in doing right now is taking the direct learning framework for a bit of a walk and see how it does. Right. Mm-hmm. I like the basic idea. I think it's kind of nice. But I don't know that I'm convinced of all of it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if, and the notion of education of intention, right? That analysis of education of intention, education of attention, calibration, right? Kind of working your way from getting yourself into the space, engaging with the space, engaging with the particular details of what's currently going on right now. That analysis makes perfect sense to me. But like I was highlighting, right, how in God's name does the education of intention work perceptually, right? It's a big ask that we don't know. So conceptually, and so when I throw that framework at you and kind of using that language, I'm taking it for a road test, and I think your challenge to it is a good challenge, right? Because it was interesting. We kind of ended up in a position where we're thinking about how watching game tape affects behavior on the field, and we know that it does. Right? I remember when I lived in Indiana. Right, this was Peyton Manning's big thing. Right, he just used to watch every single inch of every single movement that everybody ever made in the week that he was about to play them, and it had clear consequences. Right, so it clearly matters. But then, for me, that felt like calibration. Rob was kind of agreeing that, but as soon as you started talking about it in terms of education of intention, of getting you into the particular kind of zone, that made sense as well. So again, it was. I liked the challenge, that the fact that you're in a practice setting rather than an academic setting. I liked the challenge that you threw back to that framing, because it's a good question, right? Yeah.
I think the one thing that stood out to me while you're talking, Andrew, was introducing this idea of attunement. And also, at least when we're talking, because to me, it's about them becoming attuned to specific information. So when we're talking about their intention and how does this now influence what's going on, then their intention, in my mind, constrains all the options of what to attend to, it actually helps them kind of narrow that down. And then so if they've watched a ton of film, they may become more attuned to certain information. And then again, that their intention helps constrain and then pick up that information and then, start interacting with it.
Yes. Of course, one of the reasons why Peyton Manning got so much out of it is that he actually spent an awful lot of time on the field as well. But,
yeah. I wanted to bring up a point, something you see with, and you sort of hit on this, Andrew, that I wanted to get Garrett and Tyler, particularly as it applies to you actually coaching and athletes. One of the things I think Prospective Control does is it turns psychology on its head, in that forever we've been associated with the start of movements. Like, think how many reaction time studies there are. Prospective control really, and Jill calls it the funnel-like type of control. It's really saying the start of movements is really not that important, right? We're actually kind of dumb when we start moving, right? We move, sometimes we move, like you said, in completely the wrong direction. And it's through, over time, it evolves, we get more accurate, we get less variable as we use this information. So this is, and the classic is Lee's, long jumping studies. I mean, people running up to the board, they're hugely variable and uncontrolled in their steps at the start, but then they hit the board the exact same thing every time. So paying attention to the initiation and reaction time that we've done so much of, Prospective Control is like that. You're looking at the wrong thing. So I think that's for me what a really, change in the way we think about movement. And I don't know if that agrees with what you teach. I think in sports we often teach like the first move is, getting off the line. And so I don't know what you guys think about that.
So I think it's a brilliant question. And before I answer kind of what my thoughts are on it, I do want to highlight the fact that something, Rob, you've done exceptionally well. When I was having drinks with Keith and others in England not too long ago, he mentioned, which, I greatly appreciate, is the fact that like the need between the two, like the researchers as well as the practitioners, in order for this to see how it actually really lives in the real world. Because obviously studies that are done in laboratories are important, but oftentimes they don't have all the information that is available, that is going to be able to allow the movers to move that way in the real world. And so that we're grateful for sure, because I do feel like that what we are working with in the front lines per se is important. So as far as like the initial start of movement, I think that back in the day, that was where I lived, right? I was trying to tell you how to start everything you did, because if you didn't start it right, you couldn't finish it right. And I realized quite quickly that was absurd. And so for me, it may live in the initial stages of a little bit of explicit guidance, such as if I have a defensive back that is struggling to do more than just break up a pass, like if he could be in position to intercept the ball, I may say something as subtle as, maybe directing your attention towards the head and upper extremity area of the individual. The eyes will specify a lot about the size of them, will specify a lot about the time to contact. The extremities themselves, regardless of whether it's shot out quickly and very lengthwise, or whether it's something where they're already out there and waiting on the contact, is going to specify a lot about what's getting ready to happen. So to me, I can drop something like that into the session before action unfolds. But after that, where I feel like truly learning is occurring is through experience. And that experience does matter because it's rich. And if I don't present a rich landscape of affordances for that opportunity to work, that athlete to work with, and Stuart Armstrong said that I use the word slices a lot, snippets, slices of the game. If it's a 4, 5, or a 6, I don't want it to be a 10 all the time. It's too complex for them. So I need to create a 4, 5, or 6 to exaggerate certain affordances in order for them to have tight windows down the field at the quarterback for them to be able to hit. And so for me as a practitioner, it's the very early stages that I might make mention to. But after that, and this is the hardest thing for me as a practitioner, was I need to be okay with the fact that me manipulating the constraints, such as the task and the environment, is me coaching and is me helping. And I just need to have a good understanding of the theoretical principles, because if I don't, I'm just applying things willy-nilly.
Yeah. No, I think that's, and that kind of the idea that the movement can compensate for itself as it goes along. The first part of the later parts and you have to kind of let it happen. You don't have to get everything perfect from the start. Garrett, do you see it in baseball? What do you see in like hitter is the first movement of hitting, is it?
I mean, to a certain extent, it does play a role, but I think it comes into how we end up coaching it. So much of, are we focused on a particular move, meaning like, well, I want you to get into your back hip or, more glute or more hip hinge or something like that. But to me, like, based upon the topic that we've been discussing, I think of like the Gibson quote of, we perceive to act and act to perceive. And so that first move is more about helping you gather information to perceive the environment better. And so to me, it would be then shifting that to when I'm working with a hitter, experiment, play with your move and changing their focus to how can you see the ball better? How can you connect to that information better? And what moves are actually going to facilitate that? It might look different. Some guy, it might be a hip hinge. Some guy might actually want to sink and bend their knees more, and it'll just look different for each guy. But in the end, it's more about the movement to perceive to help guide the rest of their action as it unfolds.
Yeah, good point. Andrew, did you want to?
Yeah, that's just, Rob, your question was spot on, because it's it. Like, when you think like taking perspective control seriously makes you realize that your reaction time is the least important part of any of it, because that's not what's driving it. That's a really interesting angle to emphasize. And it also makes me think, so Rhino Bootsma does a bunch of stuff, and he's been looking at a bunch of information variables for control of various things, steering and navigation and stuff. And it's funny, he thinks of it in terms of these fractional information variables. And I finally realized actually what he's doing. I think what he's actually finding is that for the first little bit of the movement, people are using position-based information. And then as soon as enough time has gone by that velocity-based information is available, the better velocity-based information for this particular task, as soon as that's available, people switch to it. But what happens is that, and so if you look over the course of the trial, it looks like they're using not a first order variable, not a second order variable, but something in between on average. But no, I think what they're doing is they're switching. And the switch happens at the beginning. And why? Because at the beginning, they haven't moved, just as Garrett was saying. They have not yet moved sufficiently to make the good quality specifying information that they need available. It takes time for that to show up. But as soon as it's available, boom, people switch to it. Yeah, so like that emphasis, that switch of emphasis from thinking about reaction time. I think about the NFL Combine, right? They do a lot of reaction timey, sprinting kind of things, right? And and there's people have been complaining about that for a million years. But it's really interesting. Again, this just gets to the idea that perspective control is a place where the rubber really meets the road between the two different approaches of thinking about skill acquisition, and we win a lot. And that's which is awesome. But that's why it's amazing, and that's why it's interesting, and it's such a good way of thinking about all the key elements as well. Yeah, so that was a great point. I loved it.
Something you just mentioned there, and what Garrett was just talking about, which I found to be very interesting. And I've been really not like gathering information such as like writing it all down, but just over the past probably 6 to 7 years, I've really been applying these principles at varying levels. One thing that I have found when I'm trying to set up essentially these or design in these affordances to the practice design, whether it's a 2v2, 2v3, 1v1, whatever it may be, whenever the defenders or the offensive players are starting in a static position, so they're not moving at all. There's no subtle backpedal. There's no shift as like a linebacker that's moving. They are almost always unsuccessful at the task. Whenever they're allowed to move, even just a subtle bit, or even I encourage movement, and that's something that is that education of intention, how I aim to interact. One thing that has been, this is something I've actually been thinking about sharing for a while, and I haven't on a call, but it's been so beneficial for me as a coach, which has been helpful, obviously, for the players, is just this suggestion of, hey, try this next one whenever you're moving a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I'm not telling them how to act necessarily, but essentially allowing for them to get information differently.
Move versus not moving. Yeah. That's cool. And it's interesting that you just observed it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We see the same in things like pedestrian crossing and driving. People make more accurate decisions about when to go. And it's completely consistent with perspective control, right? When perspective control tells me, am I what I'm doing now going to get me to where I want to be? When you're not doing anything now, right? There's no perspective information when you're not moving. It doesn't become active until you move in some way. So it totally. The other one, practical example, with if we go back to baseball, is explains why it's really the hardest ball to catch as the outfield is the one straight over your head. If you look at this perspective information, you can perfectly explain why that's the case.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to quickly get to is maybe this applies to the fact, one of the arguments against perspective control is when you have to move really quickly, how could you possibly control online, right? We have visual motor delays, like it takes the time for information to get to our eyes, to our muscles. For moving a really fast movement like baseball batting or something, how could we possibly do that? Any thoughts on that kind of point?
Can I just jump in and say that immediately connects to the thing you were just saying a second ago, namely that, it takes a little while for the system to get up and running, but once it's up and running, then you're off to the races, right? So the issue is, there might be that initial delay, but once the system, like the goal is not to, it's the switch of thinking of an information processing and information transmission stage by stage by stage versus tuning up a system and getting it running and resonating to whatever it's currently, like those two different metaphors, right? So it takes time to get up and running, but once you're up and running, then actually the issue of delays may or may not be the right question. And so I know for a fact that when people look at neural networks and network thinking about the brain, there's these things called motifs, right? Which is just ways of arranging nervous system components or network components so that they do certain things. And some of these motifs, it turns out, no delay. The whole point of them is they're a structural organization that once they are up and running, there's no functional delay. You got to get them up and running, but at least it's physiologically possible, right? So I think your question immediately just connects back to what you were saying about reaction time. Who cares? The question is, what happens once you're up and running? What's available to you, and what are you what's the state of the system once it's doing, and not at any given instant in time, but across the whole action.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys both see that, Garrett and Tyler. Like things that are really fast, you're still seeing adjustments. They may be small, but they're going. There's online. Yeah,
it's constant. Go ahead, Garrett.
Well, I had one question. I don't know if we have necessarily time for it, but the question that I had was, how does this play in when you have things like no look passes, or there's a video of Joe Mauer, there was a ball hit off the backstop, and he looks, he sees it, and then he turns his head, and then he puts his hand down and is able to catch the ball. So I guess how does perspective control play into actions where at the end, the performer is not necessarily looking at what it is he's necessarily doing?
He either got lucky, or maybe he saw enough of the event to have all the perspective information that he needed. Maybe that's the skill, is that one of the things you do is that you need less and less of the event to get access to the prospective information, but it does still take time. He still had to look at it before it worked. But
the example you just gave, Andrew, was the ones that were with, I think it was Ronaldo in soccer, and they're turning the lights off and able to pick up enough of the information. To go back to your question that you asked, Rob, I would say, number one, it's just that constant updating, is that constant need for recalibrating and really what speaks to me, I hear perceptual attunement, and I go back again, and I know I've said it 2 or 3 or 4 times already, but the experience in something that is somewhat representative. Like it doesn't have to be a 10, it shouldn't be a 10. We talked about that on calls before, but it definitely should have some aspects of the affordances that they're going to overlap either with the target sport or they're going to be present exactly in the target sport. Otherwise, that's when you start to hear coaches or even commentators saying, well, they're out of sync. Well, they're out of sync because they haven't been experiencing anything like it. They're not calibrated to it whatsoever. They're not attuned to the information. And so whenever the affordances are specified by that information, they can't even act upon them because their action capabilities don't meet, that requirement. And that's the way I see it as far as the sport. And that's why you hear, us in Emergence and Sean and I specifically talking about just the need for certain levels of representative task design. And whether it's right, wrong, or otherwise, I can tell you that when I put my athletes in situations that are not like the game, and I used to do that often, they were not very good at the game. And when I put my athletes in front of different problems to solve on a regular basis, and they can essentially search through their opportunities and see what their affordance they were going to accept or affordances they were going to accept, they're far better at their sport.
Are you telling me people learn to do what they?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's big if true, man. I'm just saying.
Yeah, your point, Garrett, was a good one. And if you really go crazy with the outfielder problem literature, they've tested all these kind of things, like directly when the ball disappears, or when it suddenly changes direction at the last minute, or but the perspective control, I think you're right. As long as you get enough, right? If you stop, you don't need continuous information, right? If you just kept doing what you're doing and the ball didn't change, the trajectory didn't change, you would end up in the right place. So you want to use the information if it's available, but you can go through these gaps where you have to look. If an outfielder takes their eye off the ball to look at the wall, something like that, it does, and then comes back. The gap when you don't have information, you know what to do, right? You just keep following the same what you've been doing before. You assume my current future is going to get me the goal. Yeah.
I certainly had that experience, just experience of so when I first started playing softball, I was playing first base. And when I first started playing softball, I was chasing everything, right? If it came off the bat in the vague direction of first base, I went after it, right? After a couple of seasons, I was standing at first base and just watching these things. I had the actual experience of badly because and was paying attention to these things, but also I just flat out noticed that I needed to watch it about a meter off the bat. And then I was like, oh yeah, that's my responsibility, or that's outfield's responsibility. And I immediately knew that then switched me into either going after the ball or getting ready on first base to take a potential out. And I think, so I agree, Rob, just that experience. But I think sort of theoretically and conceptually that makes sense as well, as the event unfolds, the information becomes available. Once you reach a certain point, that information is available. And actually, once you've got it, and one of the things about fly balls is, of course, is that there's nothing pushing them anymore, right? It's just projectile motion. So the physics of it are very straightforward, etc. So you can just do these certain things and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Back about 2 or 3 years ago, whenever I first started reading about perspective control, and I've referenced the paper already, Fajan and Turvey and colleagues, they said in your book, you're speaking to reactions and different stuff. They said in the absence of perspective control, action would be reduced to merely reacting, which would not suffice in many fast-paced sporting environments. And I remember I read that. At that time, I had not actually didn't really know truly what perspective control was. But I was like, well, that makes sense. And then, you even hear practitioners in the field now saying, well, their reaction time is better. It's like, well, if they're just purely reacting to something, number one, they're probably not moving, which means they're not picking up information to guide further movement, and they're probably not going to be very successful. But that's what really spoke to me, was that merely reacting part.
Yeah.
Just catching.
That's it. That's it. It's the difference. You're not there's a difference between reacting and starting to produce an appropriate action. Those are two wildly different things. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Bring it all around. I wanted to get back to your, embodied cognition and perception, Garrett. I think where this applies, one of the things that we really haven't figured out in perspective control, for example, with the fly ball example, is kind of what happens at the end. Right, it gets you to the ball, but how do you slow down appropriately? How do you know how high to put up your glove? And that's where I think, perceiving some of the stuff like Jeff Bingham and Bill have done, perceiving the world in body units, which is kind of embodied perception. How many strides left before I get to the ball? That kind of thing is the way that you can kind of get at some of those issues. Perceiving the ball in eye heights. Arm lengths, so I think we need some work to do to figure out exactly what's going on there, but I think that's how you can kind of tie it all in. So
that thing is something that you're speaking to, Rob, is something I've really been trying to look into myself. And I remember you've spoken to it quite eloquently on a podcast. I think you were talking about Gibson at the time, but you're saying the updating of the mapping between the perceptual systems and the action systems. That part is very intriguing to me, and I'm still seeking more information there. But that embodied cognition aspect does seem to kind of encapsulate it.
Yeah, the calibration stuff that Jeff does is dense. I mean, it's Jeff, right? His papers are dense, but they're good. And calibration it's a topic he's really spent a great deal of time engaging with, because he understands how important it is, because it's a very non-trivial issue. You want to be able to tell us an information-based story as to why you were using information that way. Right. And it's complicated, but it's rewarding when you get into it.
Yeah. So I guess we should wrap it up. We've gone around. We could talk all day. This is a fun topic. I don't know if we want to go around the room. Anyone have any last words or anything they want to say on the topic? Tyler, I will go there.
I think for me, more than anything, this has been an enlightening conversation, and I really feel like it's been an opportunity to be transparent about a lot of things for me, particularly, as a practitioner, kind of things that I, admittingly, like working through. I feel like I have a good grasp of the ideas that form an ecological approach, and essentially, I would have never thought that I'd be studying ecological psychology as a young kid, but like I'm not an experimental psychologist, but at the same time, I need to have a good understanding of the ideas in order for me to create relevant practice activities for my athletes. And so I'll continue to update, but I can tell you that this is something that is literally living and breathing on a regular basis here in the States. And there's a massively growing number of people who are, if anything else, they're like, well, that seems to make more sense. They may not be able to put their finger on why, but they also know that they experience it as coaches, and they've had those fleeting moments why. So more than anything, thanks to you guys as the researchers for putting out good material, and we'll continue to keep using it.
Andrew, did you have any?
Yeah, it's just so thank you, everybody. This is a lot of fun. I always get a lot out of a conversation, throwing all this kind of stuff around, and I've got a lot of things to add to sort of think about. I think the point, Tyler, just about connecting to like the things that we're doing in sort of academic and research sort of ends, and how that's being received in the more practice-based kind of ideas. You said something earlier about you having to make that sort of the transition for yourself of understanding that manipulating constraints is coaching. When you take this approach. And I've become endlessly fascinated actually by the fact that the things we are talking about, prospective control, it's not just a tweak on anything. It's and this is why it's kind of a nice example, because it's a kind of a really clear example of the absolutely tremendous rethink you have to do in order to really engage with these ideas. And just thinking about the idea of like, it doesn't just tweak the job of a coach. It fundamentally changes the job of the coach. The job of the coach now is to create these environments, and that's coaching. It's coaching in action. It's coaching. It's embodied coaching, right? And it's so fundamentally different. And it's just really interesting that this topic, this issue of prospective control, getting just really naturally brings up that massive shift in thinking that's really kind of required. So again, this is confirming my basic belief that prospective control is one of the single most fun, interesting, relevant, useful topics that we're currently got going on right now, because there's data on it, and we're comparing theories, and it's a nice way of conceptualizing and thinking about all the really radical mind shift you have to do to get into this stuff. So yeah, thank you. That was a ton of fun.
Mm-hmm. Before Garrett jumps in, I just want to highlight what you just now said, because that is exactly what it is as far as a complete shift in its head. And that is what is very challenging for a lot of coaches. But
of course.
But it was very difficult for me. I'm like, have I been wasting people's time for the past 7 years? Mm-hmm. That's a hard question to answer. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Garrett, did you want to?
I mean, it's kind of hard to follow up Andrew's answer, but he definitely highlights like why, for me, this is something that I'm really, really interested in and really passionate about, and find it super fun to jump down this rabbit hole, because I think it does explain things a lot better than before, because we were always struggling to see like, why was it that some guys like these things worked, and then for other guys, from a traditional model approach, like why would some guys get better and others not? And I think this, for me, this takes sort of my ego out of it, and allows me to be alongside the athletes and help them. And I don't necessarily have to have all the answers. Like, and that's something as a coach I really like, is that I just need to understand certain principles, and through that I can guide them to finding the answer or finding what works best for them. And so that's, for me, that's what I really love about like these ideas.
Yeah. No, great points, guys. And yeah, as a researcher, I would say, I think we did a good job today showing that this is still an evolving idea. Prospective control is a great, really powerful information-based control, but like the one you mentioned, Andrew, Brett's idea of affordance-based control is like just 10 years old, basically. It's all and the points you guys made are Garrett and Tyler about deception and studying film, and like that's all good stuff. Like keep challenging and grow, but it doesn't have all the answers right now. It's still a developing theory, and so I think but I think it's a really it's amazing. It's a wonderful concept, I think, both, powerful in that explaining behavior. And I think it's just, like we keep saying, it's just a really cool thing, perspective control. So I would really encourage anyone to kind of dive in and try to make sense of it. It's something you have to kind of read it a while to get the point of it. At first, it's like, what's the deal? But once you get it, it's a big deal. Yeah. So thanks very much, guys. And I'm going to stop the broadcast here. Thanks for everyone that followed along.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for the fun discussion, guys. And remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.